There are two kinds of learning: classical conditioning, in which a person or an animal learns a reaction, a reflexive reaction to some stimulus. This was studied by Ivan Pavlov, in which he taught dogs to salivate to a stimulus like the sound of a bell. The other kind of learning is called operant conditioning, in which we learn behaviors, movements of our body, like playing a guitar, typing a keyboard, riding a bike. These behaviors are learned through their consequences. So, for example, positive reinforcement is a type of operant conditioning. In this video, we're going to learn about classical conditioning. The principles of classical conditioning were studied the most by Dr. Ivan Pavlov of Russia, who lived from 1849 to 1936. And Pavlov studied, his favorite animal was dogs, and he studied dogs in his lab in Moscow, and he was studying the digestive system of dogs when he accidentally discovered that dogs become conditioned to stimuli. Here is a photo that shows Pavlov in his lab with one of his subjects, the dog, along with many of his students and colleagues. Here we see Pavlov in his lab doing some surgery on a dog who's been anesthetized. And what he did was make an incision on the side of the jaw of the dog and then insert a tube so he could collect saliva in order to measure the digestive system. Here we see Pavlov watching one of his colleagues training a dog, and on the dog's jaw you see the little device that's been implanted into his salivary glands to collect saliva. So Pavlov was really studying salivation, the drooling of dogs, when he discovered that dogs would learn to salivate to a stimulus like his footsteps, for example. Here we see an illustration of Pavlov's research. He'd have a dog in a harness and a way to measure how much salivation occurred. He'd give the dog food and measure how much salivation. Then during classical conditioning, he would introduce another stimulus, like, say, ring a bell. He'd ring a bell, then give the dog food. He'd do that over and over again. And after a while, he discovered that if he rang the bell, some saliva would come out of the dog's mouth. So this is classical conditioning. Pavlov's research is so well known that there are many cartoons about it. Just for fun, let's look at a couple cartoons. On the left, the dog says, "I don't know about you, but that bell's starting to put me off my food." Yeah, there's Pavlov ringing the bell. And then on the right, we got the Peanuts cartoon with Snoopy. The ears hear the can opener. Right away, the stomach knows the supper is coming. How do the ears tell the stomach? I've never been able to figure that out. Well, of course, psychologists have figured it out. The ears tell the stomach through the nervous system. A couple more cartoons on the left. The dog says, "Watch what I can make Pavlov do. As soon as I drool, he'll smile and write in his little book." Yeah, Pavlov was pretty smart to come up with this idea of classical conditioning just by studying dog drool. And then on the right, we have the guy selling hot dogs on the street. They're called Pavlov's dogs. And he's ringing the bell, of course. I like to ask students, does the name Pavlov ring a bell? No, but it makes my mouth water. Here's a couple more cartoons on the left. Dinner's ready. Pavlov and his dog were never popular at dinner parties. Yeah, they're drooling. And then on the right, unbeknownst to most students of psychology, Pavlov's first experiment was to ring a bell and cause his dog to attack Freud's cat. Ha ha ha. Well, no. First of all, training a dog to attack a cat is operant conditioning, not classical conditioning. Secondly, did Freud live at the same time as Pavlov? Yes, they did. Around 1900, Freud was studying the interpretation of dreams, and Pavlov was studying dog drool. No, they did not live across the street from each other. Freud lived in Vienna, Austria, and Pavlov was in Moscow, Russia. And did Freud have a cat? I don't think so. I never heard of a cat with Freud. Okay, back to the concept of classical conditioning. Before conditioning, If we ring a bell, we get no saliva from the dog. During conditioning, what we do is we pair together two stimuli, in this case, the sound of a bell and food in the mouth. So sound of a bell, food in the mouth, sound of the bell, food in the mouth. Of course, the food in the mouth automatically causes saliva. What happens is the brain learns a connection between the bell and the food. And so later when you ring the bell, some saliva will occur. That's classical conditioning. Psychologists have terminology we use for these different components of classical conditioning. So before any conditioning, the bell is called a neutral stimulus because it does not have any effect on salivation. During conditioning, the bell is called a conditioned stimulus. The word condition means learn. So this is the stimulus that the animal is going to learn to respond to. The food placed in the mouth is called an unconditioned stimulus. Unconditioned means natural or not learned, which means it just naturally happens that if you put food in a dog's mouth, the dog will salivate. And so the salivation is called an unconditioned response, a natural or not learned response. And then after conditioning, the bell, the conditioned stimulus, now produces some salivation. So that salivation is called a conditioned response. Conditioned means learned. In psychology, we have little nicknames for each of these components. So for example, the bell, the conditioned stimulus, is called a CS. And the food placed in the mouth is called a US, meaning unconditioned stimulus. And when you put food in the dog's mouth and the saliva occurs, this salivation is called an unconditioned response, so it's a UR. And then when you ring the bell, which is a CS, and some salivation occurs, that salivation is called a CR because it's been learned. So the way to remember these terms are a little bit complicated to remember, but the way to remember them is when you see the C in your mind, turn that C into an L, learned. C stands for conditional, which means learned. And the U, turn it upside down and make it into an N. It's natural or not learned. Stimulus for S is stimulus and R response. So this illustration shows the basic components of classical conditioning. We ring the bell, which is called a CS. We then put some food in the dog's mouth. The food placed in the dog's mouth is called a US. And then the dog will salivate. When the dog salivates to the food placed in its mouth, that's natural. It's not learned, so that's called a UR. But if the dog salivates when we ring the bell, that salivation response is called a CR, a conditioned response. Of course, classical conditioning doesn't just work on dogs, it also works on humans, and this was first demonstrated by American psychologist John B. Watson in 1920. He showed that a baby called little Albert could learn to be afraid of a white rat because he paired together a loud noise which he made by clanging a metal bar with a hammer. He showed little Albert could become afraid, could learn to be afraid of a white rat. And in fact, his fear of the white rat spread to other animals that were similar to the white rat. This is called generalization. So yes, classical conditioning works on humans too. By the way, this experiment today is considered to be very unethical. You could not do this experiment today. What's most important about classical conditioning is that it is so important in so many different ways. Almost all of our emotional reactions are learned through classical conditioning. People who have trauma, for example, people who develop PTSD, people who develop phobias, of course. But you could learn to like things or dislike things through this process. So pretty much any reflexive reaction, jealousy, anger, liking, fear, disliking, pleasant and unpleasant, can be learned to pretty much any stimulus. We can learn to like or dislike pretty much anything through the process of classical conditioning. So this is a very important process to learn how it works and how it is applied by advertisers and politicians and others to try to get us to emotionally react to things. A very common example of classical conditioning that you've probably experienced is called taste aversion. This happens when we eat something that makes us sick. So for example, if I eat some shrimp and that shrimp has gone bad, I get sick. Then later my brain learns to have an aversion for shrimp. I can't even stand the thought of shrimp. In this case, the particular taste of shrimp is called the CS, the conditioned stimulus. The germs or whatever is wrong with the shrimp is called the US, the unconditioned stimulus. That makes us sick. We have an itchy feeling. That's the unconditioned response. And then the learned response, the CR, C means conditioned, which means learned, is to have an aversion toward shrimp. Advertisers and politicians use classical conditioning all the time to make you like certain things or dislike certain things. So if I'm trying to sell yellow sports cars to young men, I might do an advertisement where I pair together a yellow sports car with a sexy girl. And that might make young men happy, and therefore they might come to like the yellow sports cars. That's classical conditioning. Politicians do this using flags and music and patriotism and all kinds of other stimuli that they are associated with to help make people like them, and then they make ads to make people dislike their opponent. Another simple example of classical conditioning: if children go to school and have lots of fun there, they learn to like school. However, if kids go to school and bad things happen at school, they're teased, they're hurt, they're insulted, they're bullied, then they learn this ishy feeling, this upset feeling about school. Okay, perhaps you're wondering if a response is learned through classical conditioning. If you have a CR, conditioned response, is there some way to get rid of it? Yes, and the process is called extinction. And the best way to do this is through what we call exposure therapy. That is, you get exposed to the thing that makes you upset, but you are exposed while you are relaxed. So the idea is that you're very, very relaxed, and then you present the CS over and over and over again, and your brain learns to be relaxed in the presence of the CS. So if you're afraid of flying on a plane, if you're afraid of snakes, if you're afraid of speaking in front of a group, if you're afraid of going into parking lots or enclosed places, you can use exposure therapy to get rid of that CR. The best form of exposure therapy is called systematic desensitization. First, you teach yourself to relax, so you get really good at relaxing. Then you make a fear hierarchy. That is, you make a list of your fears, starting from the greatest and working all the way down to the smallest. Then you do the extinction by going through these what we call baby steps, little tiny steps in which you get relaxed, and then you start at the very bottom of your fear hierarchy to extinguish the fear of that particular thing. And then you gradually work your way up your fear hierarchy. And this will work 100% of the time if you do it correctly. Okay, we'll end with a couple of cartoons. On the left, we have some of Pavlov's dogs who years later, they've invited Pavlov over for dinner. Oh, good, it'll be nice to see him. And then the bell rings, ding dong, and they start salivating, of course. And then on the right, Pavlov's cat. He rings the bell, and Pavlov has to bring the food. Okay, everybody. Thanks for watching and learning about classical conditioning. My name is Bruce Hinrichs. My channel is called Brucey. Please watch some of my other videos on psychology. Bye.